Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, Jules and I review the Olympus Pen EE-2, a particularly beautiful, simple and easy to use version of the Olympus Pen series by the legendary designer Yoshihisa Maitani. If you haven't seen my review of the original Olympus Pen, I would encourage you to go back there because there's a much more context in that episode. And for this one here, I want to focus on the Olympus EE-2. And why was I drawn to this camera? There are three big reasons. The first one is visual. I just really like the grayish leatherette and the gray of this camera. It has a lot of visual appeal to me. Then that it is a true point and shoot half frame camera. All you have to do is frame and take the shot, and this is also all you can do, so there's no focusing possibility, no big opportunity to manipulate the exposure and so on. You basically frame and take a shot. And last but not least, I was also curious to explore the Olympus Pen series by the legendary designer Yoshihisa Maitani a bit more and get a better understanding of it, and not just focus on the very first Olympus Pen that I had reviewed before and that I really enjoy shooting, but I was kind of curious to learn more about the entire series and get a better understanding of it. And as a result of that, I ended up with the Pen EE-2, which we will discuss more in a minute. I purchased the camera from Japan in great condition with a functioning red tongue or red flag as it's also called in the viewfinder. This is basically a safety feature that prevents you from taking a shot that would be underexposed. So the internal selenium light meter kind of speaks to that red flag, and if there's not enough light available to properly expose it, then it shows up. And this is always a good test whether the camera is still functioning, and also to some extent at least whether the built-in selenium meter is still functioning. As these deplete over time, this is a potential problem about the camera, which we will discuss more in a minute. I took the camera with me on a recent trip to Mallorca, kind of capturing some casual travel photos, basically one roll of Kodak Ektar. And I also took it out together with Jules on a wintry morning in the English Garden here in Munich, shooting some black and white film. And as always, these films were developed and scanned by my trusted On Film Lab in Frankfurt. And of course, I can't wait to share the results here with you. So let's get started. Before we dive into the Olympus Pen EE-2, it makes sense to take a step back and look at the entire camera series. Because the Olympus Pen is arguably one of the most successful camera series ever produced, and its designer Yoshihisa Maitani went on to become a legend. This was his very first project, the original Olympus Pen, but from then on he continued to become one of the most important designers at Olympus, and I would argue even one of the most influential camera designers up to date. And the Olympus Pen series was produced for a very long time, with the first one released in 1959 and then all the way up to at least 1983. And the problem is that during that long production time you saw all sorts of different models and improvements and so on, and At least to me in the beginning, it was not a particularly accessible camera system, in part because of the naming conventions, and I think it makes sense to take a closer look and kind of unwrap it a little bit and look at the broad categories that you can define when looking at the Olympus Pen system. So, broadly speaking, the first category consists of the original pen and the Pen S. The original and all of these cameras are fully manual when it comes to the control of the shutter speed, the aperture, and the focusing. And the original came with the legendary 28mm f3.5 lens, and while the S comes with the allegedly slightly better 30mm f2.8 lens. There was also the Pen W, which came with a 25mm f2.8 lens, and it was produced in black and develops a very nice patina over time. This is why it is heavily sought after. It's a very rare camera. It's a beautiful one. And yet, looking at it from today's perspective, the argument of Pen W with a wider lens is a little bit obsolete if you look at the Pentax 17, which is also a half-frame camera coming with a 25mm focal length. So this is a little bit passé, I would say, and what very few people know is that the Pen S was also produced in very small quantities in black, but nobody really knows this or talks about it, so let's try to keep it a secret. So if you ever see one show up, a Pen S in black, it is very likely to be quite expensive and rare. The next big category is already the Olympus Pen EE, so the ones that we're discussing here. These were introduced in 1961, and they aim to offer an extremely easy-to-use alternative to the successful original. Basically, a camera that gives you peace of mind and is as easy to use as possible. And the idea here was to introduce a so-called electric eye, hence EE the name, and have a built-in selenium light meter that would talk to the camera and the shutter speed mechanism, and have two different shutter speeds, 1/40th of a second and 1/200th of a second, very simple, and the camera would automatically choose the fitting shutter speed and close the aperture for you. And again, this one was available with the original traditional lens, the 28mm f3.5, or as an S version with the S designation, so EES for instance, with the 30mm f2.8, but with the difference that the 2.8 lens needed a focusing ring. So if you want the true, simple as possible point-and-shoot experience, you rather go for one without the S designation, so the EE, EE2 or EE3. And the only problem about the first one is its limited ISO range that maxes out at 200. And then there is the EE2 that suddenly introduces this beautiful expanded ISO range up to ISO 400, and also the gray leatherette. Then there is the Pen D as a next large cluster, which was released in 1962, and it came with a faster maximum shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, and a built-in uncoupled light meter, first a selenium and then a CDS cell, which was also interesting. And the lens was a 32mm f1.9 in the beginning, and then even an f1.7 towards the end for the D3. And here I would say especially the D2 and D3 models are very, very interesting, already coming with the CDS cells and kind of moving away from the selenium meters that also have their problems. But of course, once you have a CDS, you also have a battery and so on. Then another broad one is the Pen EE-D, which, as the name suggests, is a combination of the EE and the D. So this is, it combined the features, and it came with an automatic exposure, but using a CDS cell with a sensitivity range from ISO 12 all the way up to 500. And a focusable 32mm f1.7 lens, so again the same best lens that you can also get with the Pen D3. And here, this one was produced from 1967 until 72. The next interesting one, and the very last one, is the Pen EF, which was launched in 1981. And while it is like the Pen EE-2 or the Pen EE-3, it comes with the same ISO range and the same shutter speeds. It also came with a built-in flash, but was not a Maitani design, and this is why I'm excluding it a little bit. It was an attempt to keep the technology kind of relevant and packing it into a new form, basically at the very end of the production cycle, but the camera was only available in black with white lettering, and it's not so interesting from today's perspective, also because of different form factor and so on. And then there was the Pen EM, which was only produced for 1 year between 1965 and 1966, so a lot earlier in the production run. And it came with an electronic shutter, an automatic film advance and rewind, and a shutter speed range from 1/30th of a second all the way up to 1/500th of a second. And this camera featured a 35mm f2 lens, so another lens, and a CDS cell for automatic or manual exposure. But while it was quite advanced, especially for the time, Olympus simply encountered production problems and couldn't kind of consistently create the quality that they were aiming for, and hence decided to stop the production again and take it off the market. So broadly speaking, you see these big clusters now, and now the big question is, why on earth did I settle on the Pen EE-2 after long debates? It really comes down to I wanted in my collection an alternative to the fully manual original pen. I still wanted the expanded ISO range all the way up to ISO 400 if I already have a selenium meter built in. I preferred having the selenium meter despite knowing that of course they can deplete over time and come with problems. And I also didn't want to have a focusing ring on it, so not the S version therefore, but instead this one. And I really wanted to have that gray leatherette, and that is of course, typically seen with the EE-2. And I just fell in love with this camera and had to have it. So this is why in this context we're looking at this one here. But honestly, after looking so closely at the entire range, I'm also intrigued by the Pen D2 and the Pen D3, or even one of the EED models, but of course this would be for another video then. So what about the features and the build quality of the Olympus Pen EE-2? We have to remember that back then it was catered to the needs of amateurs and consumers, and it was an attempt by Olympus to make the very successful Olympus Pen more accessible to a broader audience. And because of that, they created this point-and-shoot approach. And as a result, you would expect a camera that is maybe of lesser build quality, but handling it from today's perspective, it just aged very, very well. It is a beautiful design. It is well crafted. You can hear the gears turning when using the film advance wheel, for instance, or pressing the shutter and everything. It just works really, really nice. And you can feel the high build quality that was already achieving back then and aiming for. And in terms of features, there are not many, because this entire camera is catering to the needs, as I said, of amateurs who just want to point and shoot. So typically all you would do is put in a film and then set your ISO selected here around the lens between ISO 25 all the way up to 400, and then the built-in selenium meter would choose the fitting shutter speed, and there are only two available. So either the faster shutter speed, which is 1/200th of a second, or the slower one, if you have less light available, which is 1/40th of a second, and then the meter would expose your film correctly. And the mechanism works very similar to the one in the Olympus Trip 35, so if you're curious about that, we are mentioning and describing that a bit in detail in the other review. For us here, looking at this camera, then there's a top plate that features a hot shoe, a rewind crank, and a very nice inscription, and of course the shutter release button. The back only comes with a viewfinder window and the film advance wheel that I've mentioned before, and the bottom has a film release button and the tripod socket, which I'm using here to attach the leather case, but of course it can also be used for a tripod. And around the lens, as mentioned, is only the ISO dial, so there's no focusing ring and so on. And the only thing is that if you use it in the flash mode, it automatically shoots at 1/40th of a second, and then you can choose a fitting aperture depending to the brightness of the flash and to the distance of your subject. You can choose f8, for instance, and then if you're further away, open up a little bit. But that's also a lot of fun using it for that purpose. And next to the hot shoe, you also have a PC sync on the front. But that's it. That's the camera. That's the very limited amount of features that you have. And this is also the joy, I would argue, of using the Olympus Pen EE-2. So what about the image quality and results? Legend has it that Yoshihisa Maitani, when he set out to produce and create his very first camera, the original Pen, spent the majority of the budget that he had for developing the camera on the lens. And he was an avid photographer himself, and he knew that what really makes a camera great is the lens, and that he should focus on the quality of that lens. And this is why allegedly he briefed the Olympus lens department back then to create a fantastic lens for the half-frame format that would be on par with a Tissot type triplet. And of course, they were a little bit confused because they were used to receiving certain budgets that they should be aiming for, or they would have other restraints. In this case, with just, okay, this is the quality that I'm aiming for, please do that. And the result was a fantastic lens in 4 elements in 3 groups. And that went on to be really legendary and contribute significantly to the success of the original Pen. And when the Pen EE came around and the further developments of the Pen EE-2 and 3, there was no reason to update the lens here. So what we have here is the same fantastic original lens, with the main difference to the original camera that you cannot focus it. So you have a small limitation that you typically need to be away at least 1.5 meters, I would say, to make sure that your subject will be sharp and in focus. So the lens is not necessarily well suited, or the camera is not necessarily well suited for shooting close-up portraits or close-ups, but instead kind of reportage style photography, travel photography, and so on. Here it really shines and creates a lot of details and a lot of sharpness and a pretty high resolution that it gets onto the small half-frame negative here. So for me, this lens is really the key success factor for the Olympus Pen series, and this is why it's also important, or was important to me, to have the same original lens in here. Of course, you could argue the downside is the maximum aperture of only f3.5 and that this is potentially limiting, but of course then look at the images in Mallorca. If you have a lot of light available, this is not an issue at all, or even the wintry photo walk ones. If you have an ISO 400 film, it's also fine. The only problem is potentially, if we look at the results, that you have a built-in selenium light meter, which are bound to deplete over time, so they lose their capacity. And since the exposure quality here is dependent on the selenium meter, you should really test this with a first test roll. And in my case, I realized, okay, I need to set the ISO a little bit different to give the film enough light and a bit more light, so to speak, and ensure that it is correctly exposed. And of course, depending on which film you're using, the available ISO range here might be a bit limiting. And I've read online in Reddit threads that you can potentially take out such a selenium meter and then reset it, so to speak, and recreate the original capacity using certain assets and so on, and things, basically things that you can purchase, like a Coca-Cola and so on. It was an interesting description. I've never tried it, and I would be curious to do so. So if you don't want to go that route, I would recommend looking at the market and finding the ones that have functioning light meters, functioning selenium meters. But this is basically the Achilles heel of this particular camera model. But if you find one in great condition, it's really a lot of fun. And as you can see here from my results, it can also create very beautiful images. So what about the handling and our personal impressions? The ergonomic feel of the Pen EE-2 is really, really good, and it's probably one of the simplest cameras to be ever featured on this channel. So there's not much to say about the handling, except that it feels very nice and also relaxing to just frame a shot and take it, and also have the 72 frames that you have in a half-frame camera to just click away and shoot. So there's not much to say. The main limitation is the ISO 400. I would wish from today's perspective that you have a wider ISO range, maybe to 1600 or even 3200. That is the only downside that I see, because it basically excludes shooting film pushed to ISO 800 or 1600 or more, and that is really unfortunate in my opinion. There's no possibility to focus the camera, there's no possibility to have control over what you do. So in contrast to the original pen, or also a modern Pentax 17, you simply don't have photographic control and just need to rely blindly on the camera and what it is doing, and just learn from your results as you go. Again, this can be felt as a limitation or be perceived as a limitation, but it can also just be very liberating and fun, that this is the kind of camera that you just throw into your bag and take with you as an everyday camera or as a travel camera when you don't want to have a serious camera that, if used correctly, can still create serious results. And then of course you can, with a typical half-frame camera, create these diptychs and triptychs and just have a lot of fun with it. You can also do prints if you want to. Many people argue, oh, half-frame is too small, it doesn't make sense. Not really, especially with these lenses. Even back then, and then a modern one like a Pentax 17, of course you can take do a print as well if you want to. The quality is certainly sufficient to get something up there, and it can also look very, very nice to see a bit more of the grain structure and so on. Personally, I like the camera so much as an accessory that I bought a fitting case from a Taiwanese seller that Jules had recommended to me. It is a beautiful leather case that kind of snuggles nicely around the camera. They're offering all sorts of cases for all sorts of camera models out there, so really dangerous for people like me and probably some of the viewers who have a larger camera collection. And I just found that despite the fact that I originally bought it because of the gray leatherette, the case even elevated the camera for me, and especially in the winter if it's really, really cold. Such a case, of course, also makes the camera feel nicer and warmer. And overall, it kind of added to that feeling of a great travel camera that just has a wrist strap and a half case on it. And yeah, you're good to go. And it's not particularly heavy. It's never in the way. So overall, a really, really nice camera and everyday travel camera. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and my review of the Olympus Pen EE-2. Fantastic little gem of a camera that gets points for its fantastic lens, high build quality, really great portability, and just overall beauty. Personally, I really, really like the grayish leatherette and overall design of this camera. For me, it nicely complements my camera collection, kind of a counterpart to the original manual Olympus Pen, and a very nice ease of use for this one here. So I can highly recommend taking a look at it, and I hope it was helpful in demystifying a little bit the original Pen series. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.